Why do some people spend 40 years working hard but never become wealthy?
Yeah, it's interesting because, that's what everyone thinks. The harder you work, the more money you make, the wealthier that you are.
Right. I mean, is it intelligence? Is it luck? Is it education? Is it income? I think it's really interesting that a lot of people, just get on this kind of, I guess, rat race or on this hamster wheel, and they just think that working more, working harder, but they don't realize the invisible things that are going on that are kind of eroding whatever it is that they're working hard for.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest, lie that we're told about being wealthy is you need to make a lot of money, and the more you make, the wealthier you are. And I think people are starting to realize this with just the cost of school in general, because we all know attorneys that are living paycheck to paycheck. My girlfriend's a dentist. She's living paycheck to paycheck. My other girlfriend's a doctor. She's falling behind on her student loans. And it's like, wait a minute, I thought these careers where you were making, $200,000, $150,000 a year, you were supposed to be rich.
So
So
I
that's
know
what
the
we've
other
all
day,
been
I
told.
remember we were having this conversation with somebody the other day, and they said, like, in some cities, like, now these are cities, I think he was talking about New York, 200 grand is breaking even.
Mhm.
Like, that's just blew my mind. Now, that's 200 gross, right, after taxes and everything, plus rent, plus the cost of living and all those kinds of things. That seemed really, really high, but I remember that was like rich when I was when I was a
Yeah.
kid.
Heck yeah. Well, but that's the whole thing, as people are used to living on one income and now they're living on two incomes and now these incomes are tighter and they made more money than they ever had before because with COVID everyone got a raise, but inflation ate away at that. And I think that that's really the trap is people, they just really focus on how much money they can make and then they miss the boat on how the wealthy actually get wealthy
Well,
because it's not through income.
that actually is it, because school doesn't really teach you how to become wealthy. Like, you
Mhm.
know what I mean? And by the way, we're not talking about cut your credit cards up and, one less Starbucks kind of a stuff. We're not. We're talking about the hidden forces, and using the system for you. So what are some of the hidden forces? The obvious one that I don't think that I realized that as a kid, I don't know about how you felt, is inflation.
Mhm.
Like, I did not realize, first of all, I do know what it is. Obviously, it's rising prices. And it's more than that, but let's just, keep it simple. Uh, okay, so that what that really means is if you save money, then you actually are falling behind, which is bizarre because you grow up. I mean, I remember my parents beating on me like, you need to save, you need to save, you need to save. And I remember when Robert wrote that book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, one of the first lines in there is savers or losers. And specifically, he was talking about this issue. And that book's, 30 years old now.
Mhm.
And it was tough to wrap my head around this.
Yeah, because a lot of people, they save money because they don't know what else to do. Like I have friends like that. They just sock away money in a savings account or in a money market, and they just don't do anything with it. But that didn't used to be as detrimental because inflation was only like 2%. But now that we've seen a massive increase in inflation, even if your savings account's going up, it's getting eroded. Well, and I think the biggest thing that people need to wrap their head around is income does give you opportunity. So if you do have more income, you do have more opportunity. But really, what gives you wealth is investing in ownership.
Or what you do with it, right? Like
Yeah.
what you're actually doing with it.
Right.
Because I'm telling you, and that for me was the game changer. And oddly enough, one of the what a really bad 4-letter word, debt, right? Like if you just think of the word debt, for a lot of people, it has this negative connotation to it. I believe growing up, save money, stay out of debt. That's what I believed. And actually those two things could not be more wrong because the reality is there is really bad debt. Okay? We're not talking about credit card debt. What I've learned is that debt and inflation are actually a team sport. Because inflation actually helps debt. Now I know it's tough to wrap my head around this as a young man, but once I started to realize that I could use debt to buy assets, and and then that debt would be paid off later in cheaper dollars. So just for example, like, that condo that you bought, it wasn't very long ago. When did you buy?
10 years, yeah.
Okay, so 10 years ago, that debt that you put on that condo was fixed.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really important point. At the time, your hand was shaking probably, and you're like, this is a lot of money. But it didn't grow.
Mm-hmm.
It stayed the same. And so what happened was inflation made that debt seem less.
Right. Yeah, because over time, that's what happens. Your mortgage seems so expensive to you, but then as you get more raises, it's easier and easier to pay. And same thing with your investment properties and the rental income and all of it versus like rent or something that moves with inflation.
Right.
And I think, people really it's almost like the word debt should have two different words, because debt on a credit card and debt on a mortgage are not really the same thing. Like debt on a mortgage that your tenants are paying off is not the same thing as taking out a 28% credit card debt. Like that's totally different. And one is very bad and one can be very good for you in the future, because that price of money is going to keep going up essentially because, inflation's here. We just had an economist on talking about it last week, and they're anticipating even more inflation, which is going to hurt savers even more.
If you look at history, it's always been here, right? And I think that was probably the biggest thing. I wish I would have learned that earlier, because what I was doing, like probably many of you, is I remember in my college dorm, we would get flooded with credit card applications. And I remember my very first one was a Union 76 gas credit card. And then after that, I got like a MasterCard. And you felt rich, right? You remember that? But you can use debt quite the opposite. You could use it actually for things that go up in value too.
Well, let's chat about that. So let's there's 4 stages to becoming wealthy. And I think that most people don't really acknowledge this. I think a lot of people think that people that are wealthy were born wealthy. Like, oh, he came from money, or she came from money, or she's a doctor, so of course she's wealthy, or, it's those two things. They either have a really good high-paying profession, or you think that they were born to money. But the truth is most people that are wealthy had neither of those. They just understood money and learned. So stage 1 is a worker. That's where everyone starts. Everyone starts by being a worker. Everyone starts by just getting a job. That's like step 1, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or a teenager. When you start, that's how you start. And then stage 2 is you start to save money. And I think that's where a lot of people are, where they work, and then they start to make a little extra money and they start saving it.
Yep.
And then,
by the way, I do think those are 2 steps that you kind of have to start with. Right?
Yeah, because in order to have any money to do anything, you need, to work and you need to save.
Yeah, I had certain benchmarks in my life. I remember one was 5, then one was 10, another one was 25 grand. I'm talking about when I was younger. I always wanted to have a little bit of cash in the bank, right? Then from there, I didn't actually jump to real estate. What I started to do was I was buying like silver coins and things like that. Stuff that I felt at the time for me were achievable, because I'm talking about, $15, $20 a coin.
Because you were like dabbling.
I was dabbling, but what I was trying to do was, what I realized is I was trying to get out of cash, right? And the reason I was trying to get out of cash is because my mind was open to the fact that, well, why are they printing so much cash?
Yeah, and I think too, a lot of middle class people, they make that leap to maybe dabble in some things, and maybe they buy a house, because that is kind of the next step. And if you look at like your mom and my parents, like most of their money is in their house. That is the 3rd stage. It's starting to own things, whether it's a house, or you start to buy stocks, or you start to dabble in, metals. Whatever it is that ownership is kind of stage 3.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people stop at stage 3.
And I would just say ownership of assets, right?
Right.
Because I also see a lot of people that what they do is they put the HELOC on their house, or maybe they don't even have a house yet. I know plenty of people that are renting that go out and buy motorcycles and boats and RVs. And by the way, you should absolutely positively go have some fun. But they're overextending. They buy the $30,000 boat and put $5,000 down and finance 25 or whatever it is. And so that is another, in my opinion, I don't know how many boats are worth more than when you bought them for, or how many RVs are worth more than when you bought them for. But those are things that definitely go down in value that you finance. And so it's no different than a credit card.
That's a good point. When you say ownership, you mean ownership of assets that are appreciating. So like a house or a business, like starting a business is an ownership. Like now you're owning your own job basically, or your own company.
Right.
And so these things, so that's like step 3. And some people, most people get to steps 2. A lot of people do get to step 3, but not everybody. And then step 4 is where you really start to become wealthy. And very few people kind of get to that step 4.
Yeah, but before we jump into step 4, I also want to talk about one potential issue that I think a lot of people do that they believe could potentially get them to step 4. And that is they turn over their financial future and their money to a wealth manager or a financial advisor. And by the way, I am not absolutely saying that you shouldn't consider that. What I'm saying is when they do, they don't know what they're doing with their money. So they blindly give it to somebody, and then they meet with them once a year. Right? And so they don't always know, and you need to be able to challenge your financial advisor on what that is. Because I remember personally, I had a situation where I had an opportunity to put some money into a retirement account, right? And I just dumped it into, I think it was like a Wells Fargo account, and it just sat in cash, but I did it for tax planning, right? And the wealth manager is like, oh my God, this is awesome. What do you want to do? And I said, I want to put it all in silver and oil, actually. And they're like, the guy started arguing with me. And I was like, listen, I don't really care what you say, but this is where I want it, right? So I stuck it all in silver and I put it all in oil. And honestly, I don't have to think about it because I study those two things. And guess what? I just checked 79% return in the last 12 months, right? Now now that is, of course, the point. Like, it's still with a wealth manager, but I understand I am directing on where I think it should go. And what happens is sometimes I think a lot of people give up their power at this point, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and that really brings us into the 4th stage, which is where people get wealthy, and that's actually being an investor. Now, what you were saying is being an investor. It's just letting somebody else dictate your investments, but either way, it is good to obviously know where your money is going and what you're doing with it. But most people never get to this investor point. And this investor point is investing in the stock market, purposely, with purpose, investing in the real estate market, investing in metals, diversifying, like really putting your money into assets that go up in value. And most people just don't get there. Or to Ken's point, maybe they put in their minimum for their 401k. They have no idea what's going on with it. They just assume it's going to be enough when they retire. And really being an investor, that's stage 4, if you want to get wealthy, you have to take control and you have to learn about investing and learn where you want to invest your money and what would be best for you. And most people never really get there. They're so focused on their job and making more money and getting a promotion and doing all the manual things to try to make more money that they don't focus on the thing that could actually make them more money passively.
Yeah. And it's a really simple thing. Like if you're socking away a bunch of money, let's say you have 50 grand sitting somewhere and it's been coming out of your paycheck. The question is, can you manage it better than someone else, right? Or at least advise them, or at least get in a conversation with them where you're in some kind of debate, right? And challenging them. Because again, I want you to understand, who are the people that are managing your money? They are commissioned salespeople. Like if somebody is handing you a bunch of money and not ever calling you, what would you do? Right? Greed steps in, and people are going to direct it, right or wrong, to the thing that's going to do the best for them. So you just need to understand how the system works. One of the cool things that I learned years ago is this thing called the self-directed IRA, which is really, really cool. And I don't know if this is available to you guys, but you should really look into this. And essentially, if you have money sitting in some of these retirement accounts, you could take your own money and you could move it into a self-directed. Now, all it is it moves it into somewhere else where you can actually direct it how you want. And then you get to decide what you want to invest it into, right? And that wealth manager is going to fight you. They're not going to make it easy for you to get access to your own money. And there are restrictions on what you can do with it, especially if you've been putting it in under some kind of a, retirement account. It's still protected inside of that retirement account. And if you don't do it correctly, there could be penalties. But it's definitely worth looking into, because at the end of the day, where we're heading, we believe that we're going to see moderate to high inflation, over the foreseeable term, based on everything that's happening or going on right now in the world. And so the question would be, after commissions, how much are you making on that 50 grand, right? It's your money. You need to take an active position. And I think that what frustrates the heck out of me is a lot of people, this money just gets spun out of their paycheck. It builds up in this account, and they literally have no idea why it grows.
So I do have a question for you, though. Like, say somebody, they're working, they're supporting a family, they're up to here. Realistically, they're not going to have time to learn how to invest or where to invest their money. So for somebody like that that's listening, like, what would you suggest?
Well, I think that's an excuse. So I don't know. You do. I do. Like, I raised a family. I have a business. I'm in real estate. I get it, but that's not all I'm invested in. How did I learn about oil? How did I learn about gold and silver? How did I learn about timber? How did I learn about water rights? It's all from study. Mm-hmm. It's all from things that I did independently. How did I learn about self-directed? Seriously.
So you think somebody should be actually, taking time out of their week? Like it's that important to be.
Let's look at this. To me, it's as important as a personal trainer at a gym, or you're fully obsessed personally with how you eat. Is everyone like that?
No.
Oh, exactly. Why did you become that way?
Because I care about my health.
Right. Okay. That's it. So if you care about your money, then you should, because it's really no different, right?
There's a lot of bad advice too, but if you find, good teachers, it's so easy to access them. Before, you had to buy books and you had to go to conferences, and now, you literally can find good advice online.
Yeah.
And
that's a good point.
Well, and I think we have to look at why some people, why a lot of people never get past stage 2 or stage 3. Like, why some people, they stick with saving and they never get past in order to even own anything. And other people, maybe they own a house, maybe they own their 401k, maybe they start a business, but they never really get to investing. And I think that that's a big thing, especially here in America, where we're such consumers. But, the reason people get in this lifestyle trap, because they definitely make more money from 20 to 40, but they also spend more money.
Money is kind of a social construct, right? Like, people look at people with money and, they think that they're immediately on some kind of pedestal or something like that, even though it's a complete illusion.
When people make people think they have money, like, people will say, oh, he's an attorney and he has a Rolex, so he is wealthy. They just assume, but maybe he's living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe he's bouncing checks. You
paying
don't really
50%
know.
tax.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's true, right? So I think that it's interesting, right? And I think that, unfortunately, they use it as a scoreboard,
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, right? And so I think it's this embarrassment where they're afraid, maybe, to say, especially the A student, right? The A student is afraid to say, I don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever met an attorney or a or a surgeon that's actually ever said that they don't know?
Well, it's funny. It's at Limitless last year. I had a couple walk up to me and we were just chatting, and they were saying how their neighbor, who's a surgeon, this couple owns 50 properties and they're doing really well and they have all this passive income. And they're like, it's really funny. Like, our neighbor, we're good friends with him. He's a surgeon. He's never once asked us about our investments or about, and I did say that. I said it's an ego thing, like he looks at himself is like, I have all this money, I'm a surgeon, I'm so smart. Why would I listen to these people who are not as smart as me and what they're doing, even though they have 50 rentals, they live right next door to him, they're working less than him, all of the things. So it is a little bit of an ego, but I think it's important to understand that people that are wealthy, for the most part, have a different mindset about what they're going to spend money on. They have a bigger picture in mind. They understand the end goal. They're not just blowing money, their whole paycheck, on stuff that's going to depreciate in value. They're actually investing and saving and money to invest in things that actually appreciate, because they just understand a bigger picture. Like a lot of our friends, they're not super flashy. Like, I would say our flashier friends have less money
For
than our friends that are actually wealthy, as far as like all the designer clothes and the best car and the best everything, all the different things. Like, a lot of our friends that are wealthy, you would not even know they're wealthy unless you really dug into their life, because they might get clothes at Target. They just don't care like people that are trying to prove something do. And I think that's a big misconception people have.
Yeah. And you're right. Yeah. And I was thinking of that surgeon story you were saying. Is what that surgeon doesn't realize is that he is the product. He's paying over half of his money in tax, and he's working a lot. He's probably doing fine. Mm-hmm. But the people next door that have 50 units of cash flow have a much, much better lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And they're not the product. The product is what they've invested in.
They're the owner.
Correct.
Yeah.
And more than likely, they used the system. They used the debt. They probably used some of their own investments, of course, and their equity. But they understood the system. So those 50 units that they own are going up as a result of inflation. And what's not going up is the debt they used.
Right.
The debt's staying the same. The balance they borrowed is staying the same. If they owned it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that's the same. But the asset is going up. So they're creating equity, and they have cash flow while they're doing whatever it is they want. Meanwhile, the surgeon, who's probably getting whacked on tax, is actually having to work more and more and more just to keep up.
And there's a ceiling too. So like when you're working, there is a ceiling. There's only so much money a surgeon can make. There's so many hours a surgeon can work. There's only so many years you can be a surgeon. But when you have these assets that continue to cash flow, and this is where people become wealthy, is they work 24 hours for you. There's no cap. There's no cap to the inflation. There's no cap to the rent increases. There's no cap to the appreciation of the properties. So and you can do it your whole entire life. And so you have to look, that's really how wealth is built and accumulated. And it doesn't mean you can't have a good job and budget and do all that and live a nice life. But if you really want to be wealthy, you have to start thinking like people that are wealthy think.
Yeah. And so that's kind of what I meant by, they're very biased in the way that they see things. And I think that the reason those people came to Limitless, think about that.
Yeah.
They came there. Why? They came there because they have a plan, but they don't know if it's the right plan. It probably is, but they want to improve on it. They want to hear other views on it. They want to see what they could do differently. So they're constantly evolving and shaping their financial future. They've taken ownership in their own money and their own lifestyle and their own net worth. And that's what I was talking about. Whereas the surgeon believes that it's how much they make.
Well, and the wealth gap in the U.S. really hinges on an ownership gap. We talk about this just from being middle class to being, wealthy, or middle class to upper class, is just home ownership at this point. Because, people that bought a home pre-2020 versus after, you're in a different world. You have a much lower mortgage payment. You know, you have a appreciating asset that's now doubled in value. So when you expedite that to somebody that's wealthy, ownership is what really is the dividing factor. You can't not own anything and be wealthy.
Everybody thinks it's expensive at the time you jump in. Point is, there's always going to be more and more and more of those.
Right.
And so, and the thing about debt, that I really, really want to emphasize here, and kind of end this with, is when I go into debt, or when Daniil goes into debt, or when our friends go into debt, or the people we teach go into debt, there's one big thing every single time. And it's just one thing. And that is, we don't look at us as the way of retiring that debt. It's always someone else. It's always a tenant. The tenant is always retiring the debt. So when we go get debt, it's always paid for, covered by somebody else every single time. So it's not like we're getting debt and it's coming out of our pay. It's covered. It's covered by something else. In my particular case, we have 10,000 tenants. So my job is to make sure I manage those tenants. We have our own management company. My job is to make sure those properties stay occupied. And if I focus on that, then the debt gets retired. So yes, I'm getting debt, but it's retired by somebody else. And so that's the difference. In using those two examples you said, on the 50 houses, which by the way is probably $15-20 million worth of real estate. You think about how much debt that is. Okay. The way that they look at it is, if I keep those 50 houses occupied, it's paying down the debt. Whereas the surgeon, he doesn't have that. And so that's the difference. It's the absolute difference in why most people never become wealthy. Because if you use the system, use inflation, use interest rates, use debt, use other people's money, use the tax system, because that's the key, especially with tax. Understanding the tax law, it's basically a manual that tells you what to do so that you can pay less tax legally. These are all things that you just don't learn in school. And it's not that complicated. Once you dip your toe in, you see that these are all things that the wealthy do to stay wealthy.